Ladies and gents, welcome to Reaction. This is why the Russian ruble is surging. What? TLDR News EU. Yeah, okay. So there was a talk like why Trump's tariff is crushing Russia's economy, and now like ruble is surging. All right. So during the war times when a lot of sanctions were put on the Russia, people like, oh, this is gonna crush their economy, and somehow ruble was surging. Then again, when a currency surges doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing, right? There's a lot of elements behind it, but still Russian ruble was getting strong back then. It is getting stronger right now, right? And the point with that is, whenever it comes to economies like this, there is always an element where you can capitalize on if you're smart enough to save your economy somehow. So ruble surging, is this going to help out Russia somehow? This is going to be interesting. Like, how is Trump's tariff going to affect other things around the globe? Right? It's a butterfly effect. It's really interesting. Like, people can't really predict what's going to happen, and something happens like, oh, wait a minute, how that happened? So let's watch this one. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. So I know which type of videos to react to more. Obviously, I like watching global news. Everybody does. But I like to analyze it, like how it's working, right? Like how it's going to have an effect on things, right? I didn't used to be this interesting before, but after I started doing reaction channel, I realized like how much things affect everything, right? Because I didn't know how much pandemic's going to affect me and my business, right? And before it did, I'm like, what the fuck? I didn't see that coming. So nowadays I try to notice everything, like how is economy going, what is happening in some other country that's going to affect things here. And it's really interesting to see like how it takes effect. So let's watch this one.
Currency, the ruble, has been on the decline. However, to the surprise of many, the first 4 months of 2025 have turned out to be one of the best periods for the Russian
See, there you go. Because of the war, somehow it surged. Okay.
Currency in recent years. After completely crashing late last year, the Russian ruble has been steadily strengthening, and in the past month has surged against the dollar, rising to its highest level since mid-2023.
I mean, it could be like rebound effect. Things have to rebound sometimes. If something catastrophic isn't happening, and I guess war's been happening with Russia like multiple years before the crash. So, if it crashed really hard, it has to rebound somewhat. It could be that. Or it could be because US said like they're going to stop the aid to Ukraine until peace talk happens. Somehow that strengthens Russia's position at global stage, where people are more comfortable doing business with Russia, like buying things from Russia. That could also surge it, who knows?
And making it the best performing currency in the world. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the ruble's recent surge, what's driving it, and what it means for the Kremlin. Who's the best politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. Let's start with a quick recap. Despite a sharp decline in the immediate aftermath of Putin's invasion, the ruble quickly recovered and reached a post-war peak and 7-year high of 50 to the dollar in June 2022. However, since then, the ruble has been declining. It fell steadily over the following year, stabilising at about 90 rubles to the dollar at the beginning of 2024. Then, towards the end of last year, it resumed its decline, going from 85 rubles to the dollar in early August to a new low of 108 in late November, with the ruble ending the year with its worst performance since 2022. There were at least 3 key reasons behind this decline.
That is kind of insane. Worse, exchange ratio than the rupee, Indian rupee. Indian rupee is like 80, 85 right now. It was 108. So labor in Russia, Moscow, Russia, or like St. Petersburg, Russia, labor there probably would have been cheaper than the India. Like, how does that work? How does that work? Right? Look at the state of look at how India is and look at how St. Petersburg and cities like those are.
First, the escalation of secondary sanctions throughout last year, like the sanctioning of Gazprom Bank, which had been the last major non-sanctioned bank in Russia, which limited Russian companies' access to foreign currency. Second, a dramatic increase in the money supply within Russia, largely as a consequence of the Kremlin's increase in military spending. This hasn't been matched by an equivalent increase in economic output or demand, and a greater supply of rubles without an equivalent increase in demand will, all else being equal, result in a weaker ruble. And third, an increase in inflation domestically has encouraged Russians to shift their cash abroad, to avoid inflation eating away at the value of their ruble deposits. This effectively involves Russians selling their rubles for foreign currency, putting further downwards pressure on the currency. However, according to recent data compiled by Bloomberg, in the past few months this trend has reversed, and the Russian ruble has been surging, strengthening by 38% against the dollar on the over-the-counter market since the beginning of this year. This means the ruble has outperformed even the traditional safe haven of gold, which has climbed 23% in the same time frame to an all-time high of $3,500 an ounce. So, what explains this surge? Well, the first thing to note is that here
it's outperformed gold because somewhat of a rebound effect, at least slightly. And yes, Trump's tariff has something to do with it. People assuming that US's leadership might be unstable, whether it is or not is not the point. People assuming that. A lot of things, global economy works on a lot of assumptions, right? People say, oh, I'm so happy Wall Street crashed. All those people, Wall Street is not world economy. That's not how world economy works, man. You really have no concept of how things work. It does matter if Wall Street crashes, right? There's a reason behind. There's a reason why you all bailed out a lot of banks in 2008, right? Stock does matter, right? That is what the global economy is, right? And this all works on predictions of the future. So people think like, oh, wait a minute, US's leadership is not stable. Yeah, the alternate sources might get, somewhat trust, like ruble and things. Even with Russia being at war, right, ruble would still get somewhat strength, right? Because people would spend there more than if they would have.
Comparing the ruble's value against the dollar. And at least some of this apparent surge is actually a consequence of the dollar's depreciation, rather than the ruble's appreciation. As you might already know, Trump's unorthodox and erratic economic policies have undermined the dollar's reputation as a safe asset, which is why the American stock market has been falling at the same time as both the dollar and US Treasuries. Usually, when the stock market falls, the dollar and US Treasuries go up, because investors are moving out of riskier assets in the stock market, into nominally safe assets like the dollar and US Treasuries. The fact that all three fell together earlier this week is proof that investors are actually just pulling their cash out of America altogether.
Now that's the proof that we live in global economy now. It's not like it wasn't global economy 20 years ago. It still was. But because of how things work today, because of how everything's on internet, countries are for the economies, investment, countries might as well be just like these virtual borders, right? So people are okay, I don't trust this economy, so I'm going to put somewhere else. Where should I put it? Oh, US dollar, US treasury. No, not even in US. I'll put it somewhere else. People can literally walk out of US if they want to make investment somewhere.
Together, and no longer see the dollar as a safe asset, or at least not as safe as it was. According to the dollar index, which measures the value of the dollar against a weighted basket of other currencies, the dollar is now down 10% from its January peak. Nonetheless, this doesn't totally explain the ruble's recent rise. After all, the ruble has risen by more than 10% against the dollar, and is up against even well-performing currencies like the euro. So, what's driving the ruble's appreciation here? Well, some of this is a consequence of the super tight monetary policy pursued by Russia's central bank. To bring down inflation, which has been rising since late 2023 and is now running at more than 10% year on year, the Russian central bank has raised rates to an eye-watering 21%. This has made it attractive to save in rubles, increasing demand for rubles and deterring Russians from stashing their cash abroad. Simultaneously, the Kremlin has tightened its fiscal policy, mainly by cutting certain subsidies and raising taxes, including corporate income tax, which has reduced the supply of rubles and helped its appreciation. Similarly, Russian exporters are still required to sell around a quarter of their foreign currency earnings on the local market, which continues to buttress the currency. However, it looks like most of this appreciation has been driven by Trump's recent overtures to Moscow. Even if Trump doesn't succeed in getting Russia and Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire, he's talked up the prospect of economic normalization with Russia. And Russia, along with North Korea and Belarus, was conspicuously excluded from his recent...
Hold up there. Trump said what? Trump said okay, we're gonna Remove some sanctions and go back to somewhat normalcy with Russia. Trump said that. No shit, ruble is going up because that's a clear sign of where White House is looking forward. That is sometimes I don't know why I still get surprised, but sometimes Trump just like throw shit out there where people are like, what the fuck, where that came from? This is a big sign, like, everything's symbolic, right? Things matter, especially at this scale, especially if you're the president of the United States, right? If you just say like, oh, we are going to do this, it sets the stage, like this is the direction White House is going. That's what people are going to assume. Like that shit is insane. Why would Russia come to the table now? Like if you just say like, oh, we'll resume the business as normal, why would Russia care now? Like, okay, why the fuck would we just screw it. Like we're not going to peace talk at all. And if you're going to peace talk, it's going to be on my term. Of course they're going to say that now.
Recent bout of tariffs. In fact, according to a recent report by Axios, Trump's so-called peace plan explicitly includes the lifting of sanctions on Russia and deeper economic cooperation between Russia and the US, especially in the energy and industrial sectors. This could be achieved by the US unilaterally.
You know what the insanity of that is? Europe is pissed off at Russia. Europe is ally of US. Europe will see this as like US is helping Russia to get better economically. So in the future, they can be even stronger military-wise and Europe can be threatened. Europe's not going to like this, right? So US is not just alienating its allies. It's like point blank, severing ties at this point. Like I said, things matter. What you claim matters. It's symbolic, right? So you have to be careful how you phrase things. I don't know, man. It feels like this is doing permanent damage.
I.e. without Ukrainian consent, which is why there's a widespread suspicion that Trump plans to go ahead with them anyway. This has, in turn, given foreign investors hope for a possible easing of US sanctions, increasing interest in the ruble and ruble assets. So, what does this actually mean for the Kremlin? Well, to be honest, it's pretty good news. The ruble's appreciation reflects renewed optimism about Russia's economic prospects and could help ease Russia's escalating inflationary crisis by making imports cheaper. This would be very welcome from the Kremlin's perspective. As we mentioned a second ago, inflation is still rising in Russia, despite some super steep interest rate hikes by the central bank. But, according to the central bank, inflation has already started to slow as a result, and Russians have reportedly started booking holidays abroad at more affordable prices. Nonetheless, the ruble's newfound strength presents a bit of a problem for Russia's budget, because the ruble's appreciation will actually make Russia's oil exports less competitive. Oil exports are currently Russia's primary source of hard currency, and, along with gas revenues, account for about 35% of the federal budget. This comes on top of a pre-existing problem for the Kremlin, plummeting global oil prices. For context, since the pandemic, oil prices have been quite high, and while sanctions after Russia's invasion of Ukraine meant Russia had to sell at a discount, global prices were still high enough for the Kremlin to rake in serious cash. However, since Trump's Liberation Day, oil prices have crashed, largely because traders expect a slowdown in global growth to hurt oil demand, which has dampened Russian oil revenues. Nonetheless, in the aggregate, the ruble's recent appreciation is good news for Russia, and the big question for both Russia and Ukraine is whether it can last. Whether the ruble appreciation continues will partly depend on whether a ceasefire will materialise, but Zelensky has recently rejected Trump's ceasefire proposal that includes the recognition.
Yeah, well, go to ground.news, /TLDR and support this channel. Look, man, here's what I'm going to say. I always try to find some optimistic side from things. So don't just mistake this as this is my take. Like people get angry at comments a lot. Like you need to see nuance what I'm saying, right? There is an element of where you have to lift sanctions against Russia. Not now, but at least in the future. You don't want to do what you did with Germany in World War I, where you just put them against the wall so bad that they springs up really stronger. And how do I mean by that? You don't want Russia to become Pakistan 2.0, where they are under debt or China immensely, right? Right now it's kind of touch and go, right? Russia find help from China, Russia find help from North Korea, even India. But if the sanctions doesn't lift, if the war drags out, if Russia's economy really crashes, they will look to China. And, Putin is, maybe because of Putin, it would never happen maybe. Russia would never be China's puppet. But Putin is not going to be there forever, right? So in the far future, there is an element where Russia becomes like how Pakistan is with China, right? You don't want to do that. Russia has like a immense amount of like nuclear. Russia and US has the most nuclear weapons. Russia economy might be suffering, but there's a lot of things already set in place for multiple decades since Cold War that gives Russia edge. So if Russia's low-key silently becomes somewhat of a puppet of China, that's a big risk for the entire West, right? So you don't want to kind of do that. You don't want to put them so far behind and back against the wall type of situation where they have to do that. So there is an element of like, let's not do too much. But for that to happen, war has to end. Peace talk has to be there. So people are like, oh, look at Trump, he's evil. He's thinking about taking sanctions off of Russia. This is not school fight where one has to be punished. This is global world. This is global economy. It's one of the global power you're talking about. Like, you need to be careful. There's a reason after World War II, you didn't do the same shit with Germany after like you did with World War I, right? There was no Weimar Republic 2.0. There was a reason behind it, right? Again, people are like, why are you comparing this? It's like extreme examples, but still. Right, well, that was why the Russian ruble is surging. By TLDR News EU. If you like my next, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.